The winter of 1876 was brutal in Colorado Territory. Snow piled up against the wooden walls of small cabins, and the wind howled through the gaps like angry spirits. In one of these cabins, just outside Fort Collins, lived a young woman named Elena Rodriguez with her family. Elena was 22 years old, which made her practically an old maid by frontier standards. Most girls her age were already married with children, but Elena was different. She had fire in her brown eyes and steel in her spine. Her father, Miguel, had come from Mexico years ago seeking a better life. Her mother, Catherine, was Irish and had met Miguel when he worked on the railroad. Together, they had built a small farm on the edge of town. Life was hard for the Rodriguez family. Miguel worked long hours trying to make their small piece of land profitable, while Catherine took in washing from the townspeople to earn extra money. Elena helped with everything, milking their 2 cows, tending the vegetable garden, and helping her mother with the laundry. But what Elena really loved was reading. Whenever she had a spare moment, she would open one of the few books they owned and lose herself in stories of faraway places. The people in Fort Collins were not always kind to the Rodriguez family. Some looked down on them because Miguel was Mexican and Catherine was Irish. In those days, many people believed that only certain types of folks deserved respect. But Elena didn't care what others thought. She held her head high and worked hard to help her family survive. One person who had taken notice of Elena was William Patterson, the son of the richest merchant in town. William was 28 years old, tall, and always dressed in fine clothes. His father owned the biggest general store in Fort Collins and had more money than most people could imagine. William had been watching Elena for months, and he had decided that he wanted to marry her. But there was something dark about William that Elena could sense right away. When he looked at her, it wasn't with kindness or love. It was the way a man might look at a horse he wanted to buy, like she was something to be owned. Elena had heard stories from other women in town about William's temper. They whispered about how he had treated his previous girlfriends, always wanting to control everything they did. The first time William approached Elena was at church on a Sunday morning. After the service, as families gathered outside to talk, William walked up to her with a confident smile. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, tipping his hat. "You look lovely today." Elena felt uncomfortable immediately. There was something in his voice that made her skin crawl. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she replied politely, trying to move toward where her parents were standing. But William stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I was wondering if you might allow me to walk you home today." "That's very kind. But my family and I walk together," Elena said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was beating fast. William's smile faltered for just a moment, but then it returned. "Of course. Perhaps another time." From that day forward, William began showing up everywhere Elena went. When she went to the general store to buy supplies, he would appear and try to carry her packages. When she attended the town's monthly dance, he would ask her to dance and wouldn't take no for an answer easily. When she walked to church, he would somehow end up walking in the same direction. Elena's father noticed what was happening and wasn't happy about it. Miguel knew that William's family looked down on Mexican people. He also knew that men like William were used to getting whatever they wanted, and they didn't handle rejection well. "Be careful around that boy," Miguel warned his daughter one evening as they sat by the fire. "Rich men like him think they can take whatever they want." "I don't like him, Papa," Elena said. "There's something mean in his eyes." Catherine looked up from her sewing. "Maybe you should be polite but firm with him, mija. Let him know clearly that you're not interested." But being clear with William wasn't easy. Every time Elena tried to tell him she wasn't interested in his attention, he would just smile and act like she was being shy. He began bringing her gifts, expensive ribbons, fancy soaps, and even a silver bracelet. Elena tried to refuse these gifts, but William would insist, saying it would be rude not to accept them. The situation got worse as winter progressed. William started telling people around town that he and Elena were courting. When Elena heard about this, she was furious. She marched right to the Patterson store and confronted him. "Mr. Patterson, you need to stop telling people that we're courting. We are not, and we never will be." William was standing behind the counter organizing some inventory. When Elena spoke, he looked up with that same confident smile. But this time Elena could see anger flashing in his blue eyes. "Now, Elena, don't be foolish," he said, his voice low so other customers couldn't hear. "You're getting older and you don't have many options." I'm offering you a good life, a chance to live in a real house with servants and fine clothes. Your family could use my help too. Elena felt her cheeks burn with anger. I don't want your help and I don't want to marry you. Please stop bothering me and my family. William's smile disappeared completely then. He leaned forward on the counter and when he spoke, his voice was cold. You're making a mistake, Elena. Girls like you don't get offers like mine very often. You should think carefully about what you're throwing away. I have thought about it, Elena replied, standing as tall as she could, and my answer is no. As she turned to leave, William called after her. This isn't over, Elena. One way or another, you're going to be my wife. Those words sent a chill down Elena's spine. She hurried home and told her parents what had happened. Miguel's face grew dark with worry. This is bad, he said. The Pattersons have a lot of power in this town. If William really wants something, he usually finds a way to get it. What can we do? Catherine asked. We need to be careful, Miguel replied. We can't afford to make enemies of the Patterson family, but we also can't let them push us around. Over the next few weeks, Elena noticed that life became harder for her family. Suddenly, people who used to bring their laundry to Catherine stopped coming. Miguel found that stores were charging him higher prices for supplies he needed for the farm. Elena realized that William was using his family's influence to pressure them. But Elena wasn't the type of person to give in to bullying. If anything, the pressure made her more determined to resist William's advances. She continued to reject his gifts and ignore his attempts to court her. She held her head high when people in town whispered about her, and she supported her family through the difficult times. Little did Elena know that her troubles were just beginning. William Patterson was not used to being told no, and his anger was growing with each rejection. Soon his attempts to win her over would turn into something much more dangerous, and Elena would find herself in need of help from the most unexpected source. As February arrived with its bitter cold winds, Elena had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The events that would unfold in the coming days would test everything she believed about courage, love, and the kindness of strangers. But for now, she simply focused on surviving each day and protecting her family from the growing storm that was William Patterson's obsession. February 15, 1876 started like any other cold morning in Fort Collins. Elena woke up before dawn to help her mother prepare for the weekly trip to the town market. Every Tuesday, the people from the surrounding farms would gather in the main square to sell their goods and buy supplies they couldn't make themselves. Elena enjoyed market days, even though they meant a lot of hard work. She liked seeing the other families, hearing the latest news, and sometimes finding a book or newspaper that someone was willing to trade. Today they were bringing eggs from their chickens, some vegetables Catherine had preserved from their fall harvest, and a few pieces of clothing Catherine had sewn during the long winter evenings. The morning air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and Elena's breath came out in white puffs as she helped her father load their wagon. Miguel had decided to come with them today, which was unusual. Normally he stayed home to take care of the animals and work on farm repairs. Why are you coming with us today, Papa? Elena asked as they climbed onto the wagon seat. Miguel's face was serious. I don't like how William Patterson has been acting lately. I want to be there in case there's any trouble. Elena felt a knot form in her stomach. Over the past week, William had become even more persistent. He had started showing up at their farm, claiming he was just checking on them. Miguel had been polite but firm, telling William that Elena wasn't receiving visitors. But William's visits were becoming more frequent and his attitude more demanding. The ride to town took about 30 minutes, and Elena spent the time looking at the beautiful winter landscape. Snow covered everything like a thick white blanket, and icicles hung from the bare tree branches like crystal decorations. Despite her worries about William, Elena felt peaceful in these quiet moments with her family. When they arrived at the market square, it was already bustling with activity. Farmers were setting up their stalls, children were running around playing games, and women were examining the goods for sale while catching up on local gossip. Elena and Catherine set up their small table near the center of the square, arranging their items neatly. At first, everything seemed normal. Several people stopped to buy eggs, and Mrs. Henderson purchased one of Catherine's hand-sewn aprons. Elena was beginning to relax when she noticed people starting to whisper and point toward the far end of the square. William Patterson was walking toward their table, and he was not alone. Behind him walked his father, Robert Patterson, and two other men Elena recognized as important business owners in town. William was dressed in his finest clothes, a dark wool coat, polished boots, and a hat that probably cost more than Elena's family made in a month. Elena's heart started beating faster. "Mama," she whispered, "he's coming." Catherine looked up and saw the approaching group. "Miguel," she called quietly to her husband, who was talking to another farmer nearby. Miguel hurried over just as William reached their table. The conversations around them began to quiet down as people sensed that something important was about to happen. "Good morning, Elena," William said loudly, his voice carrying across the square. "You look beautiful today." Elena kept her eyes down and continued arranging the items on their table. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson. I have something very important to ask you," William continued, and Elena noticed that his voice was getting louder. More people were stopping what they were doing to listen. Elena looked up then and saw that William's face was flushed, and his eyes had a strange, excited look in them. Behind him, his father and the other men were watching with interest. "Elena Rodriguez," William said, and his voice boomed across the square. "I am asking you, in front of all these good people, to marry me and become my wife." A gasp went up from the crowd that had gathered around them. Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. This wasn't a romantic proposal, it was a trap. William was asking her in public, in front of half the town, thinking that she wouldn't dare to embarrass him with another rejection. Elena stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky but her voice steady. "Mr. Patterson, I have told you many times that I am not interested in marrying you. My answer is no," the crowd murmured with surprise. In those days, it was very unusual for a young woman to publicly reject a wealthy man's proposal, especially when her own family didn't have much money. William's face changed completely. The confident smile disappeared and his expression became dark and dangerous. "Elena, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm offering you everything a woman could want." "I understand perfectly," Elena replied, her voice growing stronger. "And I'm telling you no." That's when William's control snapped completely. "You ungrateful little," he started, using words that made several women in the crowd gasp and cover their children's ears. Before anyone could react, William stepped forward and struck Elena hard across the face with the back of his hand. The sound echoed across the now silent square like a gunshot. Elena stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek where she could already feel the burning pain spreading. She could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. "William," Robert Patterson called out, but his son wasn't listening to anyone now. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" William shouted, grabbing Elena by the shoulders and shaking her violently.
"Do you know who I am?"
"Do you know what I could do to your family?" Elena tried to pull away, but William's grip was too strong. The crowd watched in stunned silence as this well-dressed gentleman showed his true nature. Some of the women looked away, unable to watch, while others stared in shock. The men in the crowd shifted nervously, but no one moved to help her. Miguel started forward, his face filled with rage, but Robert Patterson and the other business owners blocked his path. "Now, Miguel," Robert said smoothly, "boys will be boys. No need for you to get involved in this. That's my daughter," Miguel shouted, trying to push past them. "And she needs to learn some manners," Robert replied coldly. "Maybe this will teach her to show proper respect to her betters." William continued his assault, calling Elena names that no woman should ever hear, especially not in public. He pushed her against their table, scattering their goods across the ground. Eggs broke and rolled in the dirt, and Catherine's carefully sewn clothes were trampled under William's expensive boots. Elena fought back as best she could, but William was much stronger. She could hear her mother crying and her father shouting, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. The faces in the crowd blurred together, and Elena realized that no one was going to help her. In this small frontier town, the Patterson family had too much power, and everyone was too afraid to stand up to them. Just when Elena thought things couldn't get worse, William raised his hand to hit her again. But as his fist came down toward her face, something unexpected happened. A shadow fell across the square, and suddenly William's hand stopped in midair. Elena looked up through her tears and saw something that would change her life forever. A tall figure had appeared as if from nowhere, and he was holding William's wrist in an iron grip. The stranger's face was calm, but there was something in his dark eyes that made William step back in fear. The entire square fell completely silent. Even the children stopped playing and stared at this mysterious man who had dared to interfere with William Patterson's business. Elena wiped the blood from her lip and looked at her unexpected rescuer, wondering who he was and why he had chosen to help a stranger when no one else would. What happened next would become the talk of Fort Collins for years to come, and it would mark the beginning of the most important chapter in Elena's life. On that same cold February morning, a young Lakota warrior named Joe River had been making his way toward Fort Collins with a different purpose entirely. At 25 years old, Joe was known among his people for his exceptional ability to move through the wilderness without making a sound. He could track an elk for days without losing the trail, and he could disappear into the forest so completely that even other warriors sometimes couldn't find him. Joe had not always been called by this name. Among his own people, he was known as Mato Najin, which meant standing bear, but the white traders had trouble with Lakota names and had started calling him Joe River because he had been found as a baby near the river that ran through their territory. Joe didn't mind the English name when he was trading with white people. Names were just sounds, he believed. What mattered was what lived in a person's heart. This morning, Joe was traveling alone, which was how he preferred it. His horse, a strong painted mare he called Windwalker, moved quietly through the snow-covered landscape. Joe had been traveling for 3 days from his tribe's winter camp, carrying a pack full of furs and handmade items that he hoped to trade for winter supplies. His people needed blankets, metal tools, and ammunition for hunting. Joe was one of the few members of his tribe who could speak English well enough to negotiate with white traders. He had learned the language years ago from a missionary who had lived with his people for a while. The missionary, an old man named Father Martinez, had been kind and respectful, unlike many white people Joe had encountered. Father Martinez had treated the Lakota as equals and had even learned some of their language in return. As Joe approached Fort Collins, he felt the familiar mixture of caution and sadness that always came when he had to enter white settlements. He had seen how his people were treated in these places, with suspicion, fear, and often outright hatred. Many white people believed that all Native Americans were dangerous savages who couldn't be trusted. Joe had experienced this prejudice many times, but he endured it because his people needed the supplies he could obtain through trading. Joe was particularly careful today because tensions between his tribe and the local white settlers had been growing worse. There had been incidents, cattle going missing, travelers being robbed, and accusations flying in both directions. Joe's chief had chosen him for this trading mission partly because of his language skills, but also because he was known for his calm temperament and his ability to avoid trouble. The plan was simple. Joe would enter town early in the morning, find the trading post, complete his business quickly, and leave before too many people noticed him. He had done this many times before, and he knew that the key was to stay quiet, be respectful, and not draw attention to himself. But as Joe reached the outskirts of Fort Collins, he could hear unusual sounds coming from the town center. There were voices, many voices, and they sounded angry and excited. Joe's warrior instincts, developed through years of hunting and protecting his people, told him that something important was happening. Joe tied Windwalker to a tree outside of town and continued on foot. He moved through the shadows between buildings using skills his grandfather had taught him as a child. In Lakota culture, the ability to observe without being seen was not just useful for hunting, it was essential for survival. As Joe got closer to the main square, he could see a large crowd gathered around something. The voices were getting louder, and Joe could sense the tension in the air. He found a position behind the blacksmith shop where he could see what was happening without being noticed. What Joe saw made his blood run cold. In the center of the square, a well-dressed white man was attacking a young woman. The man was shouting at her, calling her terrible names, and had obviously already hit her because Joe could see blood on her face. The woman was trying to defend herself, but she was much smaller and weaker than her attacker. What shocked Joe even more was that there were dozens of people watching this happen, and not one of them was trying to help the woman. He could see an older man and woman who looked like they might be the victim's parents, but other people were holding them back. Everyone else just stood there watching, as if they were seeing a show instead of a real person being hurt. Joe's first instinct was to intervene immediately. In Lakota culture, protecting the innocent was one of the most important duties of a warrior. But Joe had learned to be cautious in white settlements. He knew that if he acted rashly, It could cause problems not just for himself but for his entire tribe. White people often used any excuse to attack Native Americans, and Joe didn't want to give them such an excuse. But as Joe watched, the violence got worse. The well-dressed man pushed the young woman against a table, scattering her family's goods across the ground. Joe could see that the woman was hurt and scared, but she was still fighting back with remarkable courage. There was something about her spirit that reminded Joe of his own sister, who had died several years ago defending their village from raiders. Joe noticed other things too. He could see that the woman's family was poor. Their clothes were patched and worn, and the items they were trying to sell were simple and handmade. The man attacking her, on the other hand, was obviously wealthy. His clothes were fine, his boots were polished, and other well-dressed people seemed to be supporting him. Joe understood what was happening here. This was about power, a powerful man using his position to hurt someone who couldn't fight back. Joe had seen this pattern before in his dealings with white settlements. The rich and powerful did whatever they wanted, while everyone else had to suffer in silence. As Joe watched, he remembered stories his grandfather had told him about the old days, before white settlers came to their lands. His grandfather had spoken of a time when warriors protected the weak and when honor meant more than wealth or status. Those stories had shaped Joe's understanding of what it meant to be a man and a warrior. Joe also thought about the teachings of his spiritual leader, who had always said that the Great Spirit put people in each other's paths for a reason. Maybe Joe was meant to be here at this moment. Maybe this was a test of his character and his commitment to the values his people had taught him. The longer Joe watched, the angrier he became, not just at the man who was hurting the woman, but at all the people who were standing around doing nothing. In Joe's culture, the whole community was responsible for protecting its members. The idea that people would just watch while someone was being hurt was completely foreign to him. Finally, when Joe saw the wealthy man raise his hand to strike the woman again, something inside him snapped. All thoughts of caution and diplomacy disappeared. Joe's grandfather had always taught him that there were times when a man had to choose between safety and honor, and this was clearly one of those times. Joe stepped out of the shadows and moved toward the crowd with the fluid, silent grace that had made him such an effective hunter. His moccasins made no sound on the packed dirt of the square, and his long black hair moved behind him like a banner. He was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of physical challenges, and there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. As Joe approached the scene, he could feel the eyes of the crowd turning toward him. He heard gasps and whispers as people noticed the Native American man walking toward their gathering. But Joe's attention was focused entirely on the woman who was about to be struck again. In that moment, Joe made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the life of the brave young woman who had shown such courage in the face of cruelty. He was about to step into a world that was not his own, to protect someone he had never met, knowing that his actions might have consequences he couldn't predict. But Joe had been raised to believe that some things were more important than personal safety, and protecting the innocent was one of them. Time seemed to slow down as Joe River moved through the crowd toward the violence happening in the center of the square. People stepped aside automatically, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. Most of the townsfolk had never seen a Lakota warrior up close, and Joe's presence was both impressive and intimidating. Joe was not a large man by warrior standards, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced real danger and survived. His buckskin clothing was well made and practical, decorated with simple beadwork that his sister had sewn before her death. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather, and a single eagle feather hung from the braid, a symbol of honor among his people. As Joe got closer, he could see the situation more clearly. The young woman's face was swollen and bleeding, but her dark eyes still blazed with defiance. She was not cowering or begging for mercy. Instead, she was standing as tall as she could, facing her attacker with remarkable courage. Joe felt a surge of respect for this stranger who refused to be broken even when facing someone much stronger. William Patterson was so focused on his assault that he didn't notice Joe approaching until the warrior was almost close enough to touch him. When William raised his hand to strike Elena again, Joe moved with the lightning speed that had made him legendary among his own people. Joe's hand shot out and caught William's wrist in a grip that was like iron. William spun around, startled, and found himself looking into the calm, dark eyes of a man who seemed completely unafraid of him. "Let go of me," William shouted, trying to pull his arm free. But Joe's grip was unbreakable. The warrior said nothing, just looked at William with an expression that was both peaceful and deadly. The entire square fell silent, except for the sound of the wind whistling between the buildings. Even the children stopped making noise, sensing that something very important was happening. Joe held William's wrist for a moment longer, then released it and stepped between William and Elena. He still hadn't said a word, but his message was clear. The attack was over. William stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist where Joe's fingers had left marks. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. "How dare you put your hands on me?" he yelled. "Do you know who I am?" Joe looked at William calmly and spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the silent square. "I know what you are," he said in perfect English, surprising everyone who heard him. The simple statement hit William like a physical blow. In just 5 words, Joe had managed to strip away all of William's pretensions and get to the heart of his character. Joe turned his attention to Elena, who was standing very still, one hand pressed to her bleeding lip. When their eyes met, Joe saw something that surprised him. Instead of fear or disgust, the reactions he usually got from white people, he saw gratitude and something that looked almost like recognition, as if she had been waiting for someone exactly like him to appear. "Are you hurt badly?" Joe asked her, his voice gentle. Elena shook her head, though it was obvious that she was in pain.
"I'll be okay," she said quietly.
"Thank you." Joe noticed that Elena's voice didn't shake when she spoke to him, even though she had been trembling during William's attack. This young woman had more courage than most of the men in the crowd who had just stood and watched. "This is outrageous." Robert Patterson had pushed through the crowd and was now standing next to his son. "How dare you interfere in our business, savage?" Joe turned to look at the older Patterson, and Robert actually took a step backward. There was something in Joe's eyes that reminded people of wild animals. Not dangerous unless threatened, but definitely not something to underestimate. "I saw a man hurting a woman," Joe said simply. "Where I come from, men who hurt women are not respected. Where you come from doesn't matter here." William had recovered some of his confidence now that his father was beside him. "This is a white man's town and you have no business being here." Joe didn't respond to William's words. Instead, he knelt down and began picking up the items that had been scattered when Elena's table was overturned. Broken eggs couldn't be saved, but he carefully gathered the clothes and other goods that could still be sold. Elena watched in amazement as this stranger, who owed her nothing, quietly helped clean up the mess that William had made. She knelt down beside Joe and began helping him, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same items. "Thank you," Elena whispered again, so quietly that only Joe could hear her. Joe looked at her and nodded. "In my tribe, we believe that the Great Spirit puts people in each other's paths for a reason," he said. "Maybe this is my reason for being here today." Miguel Rodriguez had finally managed to push past the men who were blocking him, and he hurried to his daughter's side. When he saw Joe helping Elena, his expression was confused but grateful. "Thank you, friend," Miguel said to Joe. "I don't know who you are, but I won't forget what you did for my daughter." Joe stood up and faced Miguel. "She is brave," he said simply. "She fought back when no one else would help her." Catherine Rodriguez had also made her way through the crowd and was now examining Elena's injuries. When she looked at Joe, her eyes were full of tears, but she managed to smile at him. "Bless you," she said. "God sent you to help us." The crowd was beginning to murmur now, people talking quietly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some were clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a Native American man interfering in white people's business. Others seemed impressed by Joe's calm courage and his obvious respect for Elena and her family. Sheriff Morrison had finally arrived, alerted by someone who had run to get him when the commotion started. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and tired eyes. He had been sheriff of Fort Collins for 10 years, and he had learned to handle difficult situations carefully. "What's going on here?" Sheriff Morrison asked, though it was obvious that he could see the blood on Elena's face and the scattered goods on the ground. "This savage attacked me." William pointed at Joe. "I want him arrested immediately." Sheriff Morrison looked around the square, taking in the scene. He could see that Elena was injured, that her family's goods were scattered, and that the crowd looked upset. He also noticed that Joe was standing calmly, not acting like someone who had started a fight. That's not what happened, Elena said, stepping forward despite her mother's attempts to hold her back. Mr. Patterson was attacking me and this man stopped him. He saved me. Sheriff Morrison looked at Elena's face, then at William, then at Joe. He had known the Patterson family for years, and he had heard rumors about William's behavior toward women. He had also dealt with Native Americans before, and he could usually tell the difference between troublemakers and decent people. Is that true? Sheriff Morrison asked the crowd. Did this man attack Mr. Patterson, or was he defending the young lady? There was an uncomfortable silence. Most of the people in the crowd had seen exactly what happened, but they were afraid to speak against the Patterson family. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had bought one of Catherine's aprons earlier, stepped forward. The Indian man didn't start anything, she said firmly. He was protecting the girl from getting beaten worse than she already was. William Patterson should be ashamed of himself. A few other people in the crowd nodded agreement, though most remained silent. Sheriff Morrison looked at Joe. What's your name, and what brings you to town? I am Joe River, Joe replied. I came to trade furs for supplies my people need. I did not come looking for trouble. Well, you found it anyway, Sheriff Morrison said, but his tone wasn't unfriendly. Mr. Patterson, are you planning to press charges? William looked around the square, realizing that he didn't have as much support as he had expected. His attack on Elena had been witnessed by dozens of people, and some of them were clearly not approving of his behavior. This isn't over, William said, looking directly at Elena. Then he turned to Joe. And you better stay away from things that don't concern you. Savage. Joe met William's angry stare with calm eyes. A strong man protects the weak, he said. A weak man hurts those who cannot fight back. I know which one you are. With that simple statement, Joe had managed to publicly shame William Patterson in front of half the town. William's face turned bright red, but he didn't know how to respond without making himself look even worse. Robert Patterson grabbed his son's arm. Come on, William. We have business to attend to. As the Pattersons walked away, Joe turned back to Elena and her family. The immediate danger was over, but Joe could see in Elena's eyes that she knew this wasn't the end of her troubles. William Patterson was not the type of man to forget being humiliated in public, especially by someone he considered beneath him. Joe also knew that his own troubles were just beginning. By interfering in the affairs of white people, he had made himself a target. But as he looked at Elena's grateful face and saw the dignity with which she was handling her situation, he knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes, Joe thought, a man has to choose between being safe and being honorable. Today, honor had won. After the Pattersons left, the crowd in the market square began to break up slowly. People gathered their belongings and returned to their business. But Joe could hear them whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some of the conversations were friendly toward him, but others were not. Can't believe that Indian had the nerve to put his hands on a white man, one voice said. Did you see how calm he was? Wasn't even scared of William Patterson, said another. Should have minded his own business. Now there's going to be trouble for sure. Joe ignored the comments and focused on helping Elena and her family gather their scattered belongings. Many of their goods were damaged beyond saving, but they managed to collect what they could. Joe noticed that Elena moved carefully, favoring her left side where William had grabbed her, but she didn't complain. Sheriff Morrison approached them as they were finishing. Miss Rodriguez, do you need to see the doctor about those injuries? Elena touched her swollen lip gingerly. I'll be fine, Sheriff Morrison. Thank you for asking. The sheriff nodded, then turned to Joe. Joe River, was it? I need to ask you a few questions. Joe straightened up and faced the sheriff directly. He had dealt with law enforcement before in other towns, and he knew that being respectful and honest was usually the best approach. I will answer your questions, Joe said. Where are you staying while you're in town? Sheriff Morrison asked. I was planning to finish my trading and leave today, Joe replied. I have a camp about an hour's ride from here. Sheriff Morrison looked thoughtful. That might not be such a good idea anymore. The Patterson family has a lot of influence in this town, and they don't like being embarrassed. You might want to consider leaving sooner rather than later. Elena stepped forward before Joe could respond. Sheriff Morrison, this man helped me when no one else would. He shouldn't be punished for doing the right thing. I'm not punishing anyone, Miss Rodriguez, the sheriff said gently. I'm just trying to prevent more trouble. Your family has already had enough problems with the Pattersons. Joe looked at Elena with surprise. You have had problems with them before? Miguel Rodriguez answered for his daughter. William Patterson has been bothering Elena for months. When she kept refusing his attention, he started using his family's influence to make life difficult for us. People stopped bringing us their laundry business and stores started charging us higher prices for supplies. Joe felt anger rising in his chest again. This was exactly the kind of behavior that made him lose faith in the white man's idea of civilization. This man uses his power to hurt innocent people and everyone just allows it? Sheriff Morrison sighed. It's not that simple, Joe. The Patterson family owns half the businesses in this town. People depend on them for their livelihood. Most folks can't afford to make enemies of them. What about justice? Joe asked. What about protecting people who cannot protect themselves? Justice is a luxury that poor people can't always afford, Elena said quietly, and there was a sadness in her voice that made Joe's heart ache. Joe studied Elena's face as she spoke. Despite everything that had happened to her, the months of harassment, the public attack, the economic pressure on her family, her spirit wasn't broken. She was still standing tall, still speaking up for herself. Joe had known many warriors who showed less courage in battle than this young woman was showing in her daily life. You are not poor in the things that matter most, Joe told Elena. You have courage, and you have dignity. Those are worth more than all of William Patterson's money. Elena looked at Joe with surprise. She wasn't used to people speaking to her with such respect, especially not men. In her experience, men usually wanted something from her or wanted to control her. But Joe spoke to her as if she were an equal, someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Thank you, Elena said, and Joe could hear that she meant it deeply. Catherine Rodriguez had been listening to this conversation while examining her daughter's injuries, and now she spoke up. You must let us repay you somehow for helping Elena. We don't have much money, but we could offer you a meal or... Joe shook his head. No payment is needed. I did what any decent person should do. But you're the only one who did it, Miguel pointed out. That makes you special. Joe was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to respond. In his culture, helping others wasn't considered special. It was just expected. The fact that his actions seemed unusual to these people told him a lot about the world they lived in. Maybe we could at least invite you to share a meal with us, Elena said. It's getting late and you must be hungry after traveling. Joe looked at the sky and realized that Elena was right. The sun was getting low and he still needed to find the trading post and complete his business. But the idea of spending more time with this remarkable family was appealing. That is very kind, Joe said, but I should finish my trading first. The trading post will close soon. Old Pete's trading post? Miguel asked. He usually stays open late on market days. You should have time. Sheriff Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange, cleared his throat. Joe, I hate to interrupt, but I think you should know that the Pattersons went straight to the trading post after they left here. Old Pete depends on their business pretty heavily. Joe understood what the sheriff was telling him without saying it directly. William Patterson was probably trying to make sure that Joe couldn't complete his trading. This was exactly the kind of petty revenge that powerful people used against those who opposed them. Then I will try anyway, Joe said simply. My people need these supplies. Elena felt a surge of anger on Joe's behalf. It wasn't enough that William had attacked her. Now he was going to try to hurt this man who had helped her. The unfairness of it made her want to scream. This is my fault, Elena said. If I had just accepted his proposal months ago, none of this would have happened. Joe turned to look at Elena and his expression was serious. No, he said firmly. You cannot blame yourself for the actions of a bad man. You have the right to choose your own path in life. No one should be able to force you to marry someone you do not want. That's easy to say, Elena replied. But look what my choices have cost my family. We've lost income. We've been treated badly by people we thought were friends, and now you're going to suffer too because you helped me. Joe was quiet for a moment, considering Elena's words. He could see that she was carrying a heavy burden of guilt and responsibility. In his culture, individual choices were important, but they were always balanced against the good of the community. He understood why Elena felt torn between her own desires and her family's welfare. Let me ask you something, Joe said finally. If you had married William Patterson to protect your family, would you have been happy? Elena laughed bitterly. Happy? I don't think William Patterson cares whether his wife is happy or not. He wants someone he can control, someone who will make him look good and give him children. He doesn't want a partner. He wants property. And do you think your family would have been happy knowing that you had sacrificed yourself for them? Elena looked at her parents, who were listening to this conversation with serious expressions. Miguel spoke first. Mija, your mother and I would never want you to marry a man who would make you miserable. We would rather struggle with our heads held high than prosper by selling our daughter to someone who doesn't deserve her. Catherine nodded agreement. We raised you to be strong and independent. We're proud of the woman you've become, and we're proud that you stood up to William Patterson even when it was difficult. Elena felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had been carrying so much guilt and worry, wondering if she was being selfish by refusing William's proposals. Hearing her parents' support meant everything to her. Joe watched this family exchange with deep respect. These people might not have much money, but they had something much more valuable. They truly cared about each other. Joe had seen wealthy families torn apart by greed and selfishness, but the Rodriguez family was united by love and shared values. Your family is rich in the ways that matter most, Joe told Elena. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. Sheriff Morrison had been watching this conversation, and now he spoke up again. This is all very touching, but I'm still worried about what happens next. William Patterson is not going to forget what happened here today. Joe looked at the sheriff. Are you saying that I should have done nothing? That I should have watched a woman being beaten and walked away? I'm not saying that at all, Sheriff Morrison replied. I'm saying that good deeds sometimes have bad consequences, and you need to be prepared for that. Elena stepped closer to Joe, and when she spoke, her voice was strong and clear. Sheriff Morrison, if William Patterson tries to hurt Joe River because he helped me, then I will testify about everything that happened here today. I will tell everyone in this town exactly what kind of man William Patterson really is. Joe looked at Elena with admiration. She was putting herself at even greater risk to protect him, just as he had protected her. This was the kind of mutual support and loyalty that Joe valued most in people. You do not need to do that, Joe told Elena. I can take care of myself. We take care of each other, Elena replied. That's what decent people do. That evening, Joe discovered that Sheriff Morrison's warnings had been correct. When he arrived at the trading post, old Pete, the weathered owner, barely looked up from his ledger book. We're closed, Pete said gruffly, though there were still customers in the store. I have furs to trade, Joe said, setting his pack on the counter. Good quality beaver and elk hides. Pete finally looked up, and Joe could see the conflict in his eyes. The old trader obviously wanted to do business. Joe's furs were excellent quality and would bring a good price. But Pete was also clearly worried about something. Look, son, Pete said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. You seem like a decent fellow, but I can't do business with you today. William Patterson was here an hour ago, and he made it very clear that any shopkeeper who trades with you will lose the Patterson family's business permanently. Joe felt disappointment, but not surprise. This was exactly the kind of pressure he had expected William to apply. I understand your position, Joe said, but my people need supplies for the winter. Surely there is some way. Pete shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, but I can't risk it. The Patterson family accounts for nearly half my business. If I lose them, I'll have to close the store. Joe picked up his pack and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Pete called out to him. Joe, there's a trader named Murphy about a day's ride north of here. He's independent, doesn't owe anything to the Patterson family. You might have better luck with him. Joe nodded his thanks and left the store. Outside, the February evening was getting colder, and snow was beginning to fall again. Joe pulled his coat tighter and walked through the town toward where he had left his horse. As he passed the Rodriguez house, he could see warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. The sight filled him with an unexpected longing. Joe had spent most of his adult life traveling alone, and he was used to solitary camping under the stars. But tonight, the idea of a warm house and friendly conversation seemed very appealing. Joe was lost in these thoughts when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Elena approaching, wrapped in a thick shawl against the cold. Joe, I was hoping I might catch you before you left town. I was just going to make camp outside town, Joe said. The trading did not go well. Elena's face fell. Because of what happened with William today? Joe nodded. It seems your William Patterson has more influence than I expected. He's not my William Patterson, Elena said firmly. And I'm sorry that helping me has caused you problems. Joe smiled at her correction. You are right. He is not your anything, and I am not sorry that I helped you. They stood there for a moment in the falling snow, and Joe noticed that Elena seemed nervous about something. She kept looking back toward her house, then at him, as if she was trying to make a difficult decision. Joe, can I ask you something? Of course, and what is your tribe like? Your people? Joe was surprised by the question. Most white people he met were either afraid of Native Americans or thought they were all the same. Elena seemed genuinely curious about his life and culture. My people are the Lakota, Joe said. We are a good people who try to live in harmony with the land and with each other. We take care of our families, we honor our elders, and we protect those who cannot protect themselves. That sounds wonderful, Elena said wistfully. Very different from here, where people only seem to care about money and status. Joe studied Elena's face in the dim light from the street lamps. There was something in her expression that suggested she was thinking about more than just casual conversation. Elena, is everything all right? You seem troubled. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Joe, I'm scared. William was so angry today, and I know he's going to find a way to get revenge. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants or until he destroys my family trying. Joe felt a protective anger rise in his chest. He cannot force you to marry him. Maybe not directly, Elena said. But he can make our lives so difficult that we have no choice. He can run us out of town or worse, and now that you've helped me, he's going to want revenge on you too. I can take care of myself, Joe said, and tomorrow I will find another trader and get the supplies my people need. What if there is no other trader willing to work with you? What if William's influence reaches further than we thought? Joe hadn't considered this possibility, but Elena was right to be concerned. If William Patterson could pressure traders in other towns the same way he had pressured old Pete, Joe might not be able to complete his mission at all. Then I will find another way, Joe said. I will not let my people suffer because of one man's anger. Elena took a deep breath, and Joe could see that she was gathering courage for something important. Joe, what if we left together? The question hung in the cold air between them like a challenge. Joe stared at Elena, not sure he had heard her correctly. What do you mean? I mean, what if I came with you? Back to your people? Would they accept me? Joe was so surprised by Elena's suggestion that for a moment he couldn't speak. When he found his voice again, he chose his words carefully. Elena, you do not understand what you are asking. Life with my people is very different from what you know here. It is harder in many ways, and once you left this world, it would be very difficult to come back. Maybe I don't want to come back, Elena said, and there was a fierceness in her voice that reminded Joe of why he had been so impressed with her courage earlier. You would leave your family, your home, everything you know? Elena looked back toward her house, where she could see her parents moving around inside. I love my family, but I can't keep putting them in danger. As long as I'm here, William is going to keep making their lives miserable. Maybe if I disappeared, he would leave them alone. Joe shook his head. Men like William Patterson do not forget when they have been defied. Even if you left, he would still want revenge on your family. Then what choice do I have? Elena asked, and Joe could hear desperation creeping into her voice. Stay here and eventually give in to his demands? Watch my family suffer because of my stubbornness? Joe understood Elena's dilemma better than she knew. In his own life, he had faced situations where all the available choices seemed bad. Sometimes a person had to choose the path that offered the most hope, even if it was uncertain and dangerous. If you came with me, Joe said slowly, it would not be easy. My people are kind, but they are also suspicious of white people. You would have to learn our ways, our language, our customs. You would have to prove yourself worthy of their trust. I'm willing to try, Elena said immediately. I'm not afraid of hard work or learning new things. And I think I would rather take my chances with people who value courage and honor than stay here with people who only care about money and power. Joe looked into Elena's eyes and saw the same determination that had impressed him when she stood up to William Patterson. This was not a woman making a desperate, emotional decision. This was someone who had thought carefully about her options and chosen the path that offered the most hope for a meaningful life. There is something else you must understand, Joe said. If you come with me, people here will assume that you are my woman. And among my people, if I bring a woman to our camp, it will be understood that I intend to marry her. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm despite the cold. She had been so focused on escaping her current situation that she hadn't thought about the romantic implications of traveling with Joe. "And what do you think about that?" she asked quietly. Joe was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. "I think you are the most courageous woman I have ever met. I think you have a good heart and a strong spirit. I think any man would be honored to have you as his wife." "That's not what I asked," Elena said. Though her heart was beating faster, Joe smiled, and Elena realized it was the first time she had seen him truly smile. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. "I think," Joe said carefully, "that I would like to know you better before either of us make such important decisions. But I also think that spending time together would help us both understand what we want." Elena nodded. This seemed like a reasonable approach. She barely knew Joe despite feeling an unusual connection to him. The idea of marriage was overwhelming, but the idea of getting to know this remarkable man better was very appealing. "So you would be willing to take me with you, even though it might cause problems with your people?" "I am willing," Joe said. "But you must be certain this is what you want. Once we leave, there will be no going back, at least not for a long time." Elena looked one more time toward her family's house, then back at Joe. In her heart, she knew that this was her chance for a different kind of life, a life where she could be valued for her character, rather than judged for her family's lack of wealth. "I'm certain," she said. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Joe said without hesitation. "If William Patterson is as vindictive as you believe, waiting will only make things more dangerous for all of us." Elena nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror. "I need to talk to my parents first. They deserve to know what I'm planning." "Of course. I will wait for you here." The conversation with Elena's parents was more difficult than she had imagined. When she told them about her plan to leave with Joe, Catherine immediately began crying. While Miguel sat in stunned silence for several minutes, "Mija, you barely know this man," Catherine said through her tears. "How can you trust him with your life?" "How can I not trust him?" Elena replied. "He risked his own safety to protect me when no one else would help. He could have walked away, but he didn't." Miguel finally found his voice. "Elena, what this man did today was honorable, but that doesn't mean you should run away with him. We can find another solution to our problems with William Patterson." "What solution, Papa? We've been dealing with his harassment for months, and it's only getting worse. Today he attacked me in public. What will he do next?" Elena's parents couldn't argue with her logic. They had all seen William's behavior escalating, and they knew that their daughter was in real danger. But to leave everything behind, to go live with people we know nothing about? Catherine's voice trailed off. Elena knelt beside her mother's chair and took her hands. "Mama, I'm not abandoning you. I'm trying to protect you. As long as I'm here, William will keep hurting our family. Maybe if I disappear, he'll leave you alone. Or maybe he'll take his anger out on us," Miguel said quietly. Elena hadn't considered this possibility, and it made her stomach clench with worry. But before she could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Miguel opened it to find Joe standing on their doorstep, holding his hat respectfully in his hands. "Forgive me for interrupting," Joe said, "but I could not help overhearing some of your conversation, and I wanted to speak with you about your concerns." Miguel invited Joe inside, and the warrior sat down carefully at their small kitchen table. In the lamplight, Elena's parents could see him more clearly than they had during the chaos at the market. He was younger than they had realized, probably not much older than Elena, and his face was kind and intelligent. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," Joe began, "I understand your worry about Elena leaving with a stranger. In your place, I would feel the same way." "Then you understand why we can't just let her go," Catherine said. "I understand why you are worried," Joe corrected gently. "But I also understand why Elena feels she must leave. William Patterson will not stop his pursuit of her, and his anger toward all of you will only grow worse." Miguel leaned forward. "What makes you so sure of that?" Joe was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have dealt with men like William Patterson before. They believe that their wealth and status give them the right to take whatever they want. When someone defies them, especially someone they consider beneath them, they become obsessed with proving their power." "But surely there are Catherine began. Laws are only as strong as the people who enforce them, Joe said, and those people often depend on men like Patterson for their livelihood. Elena's parents exchanged glances. They knew Joe was right. Sheriff Morrison was a decent man, but he had to work within the political realities of the town. What about Elena's safety with your people? Miguel asked. How do we know she won't be trading one danger for another? Joe appreciated Miguel's directness. You don't know, he said honestly. I cannot promise that life with my people will be easy for Elena. She will face challenges and difficulties that she has never experienced before. Then why should we trust you with our daughter? Catherine asked. Joe looked directly at Catherine, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with quiet conviction. Because among my people, protecting the women and children is the most sacred duty of every warrior. Because we judge people by their character, not by their skin color or their family's wealth. And because I give you my word that I will guard Elena's safety and happiness with my life. The simple sincerity in Joe's voice was more convincing than any elaborate promise could have been. Elena felt her heart skip a beat at his words, while her parents found themselves believing this stranger despite their fears. What would happen to Elena in your village? Miguel asked. What would her life be like? Joe thought carefully before answering. At first it would be very difficult. She would have to learn our language, our customs, our way of life. Some people might be suspicious of her because she is white. But my sister Luna would help her. Luna is kind and patient, and she would teach Elena what she needs to know. Your sister? Elena asked. She hadn't known Joe had a sister. Luna is not my blood sister, Joe explained. But in our culture, we often adopt people into our families. Luna was orphaned as a child, and my family raised her. She is now married to one of our finest warriors, and she helps other women in our village learn the skills they need. Catherine wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. And what about marriage? If Elena goes with you, nothing will happen that Elena does not want to happen, Joe said firmly. Among my people, women have the right to choose their own husbands. If Elena decides she wants to marry me, it will be her choice. If she decides she wants to marry someone else or no one at all, that will also be her choice. Elena felt relief wash over her. The idea of being forced into another unwanted relationship had been one of her biggest fears about Joe's proposal. How can we be sure you're telling us the truth? Miguel asked. Joe reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a carved piece of bone decorated with intricate designs. This is a truth token, Joe said, placing it on the table. Among my people, when someone carries this while speaking, they are bound by sacred law to tell only the truth. I have carried it throughout our conversation. Elena's parents stared at the carved bone. Whether or not they believed in its power, they could see that Joe believed in it completely. There's something else you should know, Joe continued. I am not just any member of my tribe. My father is one of our most respected elders, and I am being trained to possibly lead our people someday. If Elena becomes my wife, she would have an honored position in our village. This revelation surprised Elena. Joe had seemed like an ordinary warrior to her, albeit an exceptional one. She hadn't realized he came from such an important family. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked. Joe smiled slightly. Because it does not change who I am or how I will treat you. Among my people, leadership is about service, not privilege. Leaders work harder than anyone else, not less. Miguel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. When he turned back to face the room, his expression was troubled but resolute. Elena, I won't pretend I'm happy about this. The idea of you leaving with a man we just met, going to live with people we've never seen in a place we've never been. It terrifies me. Papa, Elena began, but Miguel held up his hand. Let me finish. It terrifies me, but I also know that staying here terrifies me more. William Patterson is dangerous, and his obsession with you is getting worse. If you stay, I'm afraid of what might happen to you. Catherine joined her husband at the window. Are you really sure about this, Mika? Once you leave, I'm sure, Mama, I can't live my life being afraid all the time. At least with Joe's people, I'll have a chance to build something new. Catherine nodded slowly, then turned to Joe. You must promise me something. If I can. Promise me that if Elena is ever unhappy, if she ever wants to come home, you will help her return to us. Joe nodded solemnly. I promise, but I also promise to do everything in my power to make sure she never wants to leave. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Elena packed her few belongings, some clothes, her mother's prayer book, a small mirror that had belonged to her grandmother, and the two novels she treasured most. Catherine insisted on packing food for the journey, while Miguel sharpened an old knife and gave it to Elena for protection. As dawn began to break, Joe brought his horse to the house. Windwalker was a beautiful painted mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition. Joe helped Elena mount behind him, showing her how to hold on safely for the long ride ahead. The goodbye was heartbreaking but brief. Elena hugged her parents tightly, promising to find a way to send word that she was safe. Catherine pressed a small wooden cross into Elena's hands, while Miguel whispered a prayer for her protection. As they rode away from Fort Collins in the early morning light, Elena looked back only once. She could see her parents standing in their doorway holding each other and watching their daughter disappear into an uncertain future. "Are you all right?" Joe asked, feeling Elena's arms tighten around his waist. "I will be," Elena replied, though her voice was shaky. "It's just hard to leave everything behind." "I know," Joe said gently, "but sometimes we must leave one life behind to find another that suits us better." The journey to Joe's village took 3 days. They traveled slowly, partly because Joe wanted to make sure Elena was comfortable on horseback, and partly because he wanted to prepare her gradually for what she would find when they arrived. On the first night, as they sat around their small campfire, Joe began teaching Elena basic words in Lakota. She proved to be a quick learner, and Joe was impressed by her determination to master the unfamiliar sounds. "Why is learning the language so important?" Elena asked. "Because language is more than just words," Joe explained. "It carries the thoughts and feelings and wisdom of a people." Elena's arrival at the Lakota village created quite a stir. Children ran alongside Windwalker as Joe guided the horse through the camp, their curious eyes fixed on the pale woman riding behind their returning warrior. Adults emerged from their teepees to watch the unusual sight, some with welcoming expressions, others with obvious suspicion. Joe brought Windwalker to a stop in front of one of the larger teepees, decorated with painted designs of eagles and buffalo. An elderly man with long gray braids and kind eyes emerged from the dwelling, followed by a woman about Elena's age with striking features and an air of quiet confidence. "Father," Luna stopped her work and looked directly at Elena. "Belonging is not about where you were born or what color your skin is. It is about what lives in your heart. You have already shown that you have the heart of our people." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at Luna's words. She had been struggling with feelings of displacement and uncertainty, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in leaving her old life behind. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Elena's relationship with Joe deepened gradually and naturally. They spent hours together as he taught her to ride Windwalker properly, showed her how to track animals, and shared stories about his people's history and traditions. Elena found herself falling in love not just with Joe but with his entire way of life. Joe, meanwhile, was amazed by Elena's transformation. The frightened young woman he had rescued in Fort Collins was becoming confident and capable. She could now speak basic Lakota, could prepare traditional meals, and had earned the respect of the tribal elders through her hard work and respectful attitude. "You are not the same person who left Fort Collins," Joe observed one evening as they sat by the river watching the sunset. "No, I'm not," Elena agreed. "I'm becoming someone I never knew I could be." "And how do you feel about that?" Elena considered the question seriously. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly free." Joe reached for her hand and Elena didn't pull away. Their relationship had been developing slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than desperation or convenience. "Elena," Joe said quietly, "I would like to ask you something important." Elena's heart began to beat faster. She had been hoping for this conversation for weeks, but she had been too shy to bring it up herself. "Among my people," Joe continued, "when a man wants to marry a woman, he must prove that he can provide for her and protect her. I believe I have shown that I can do these things." "You have," Elena said softly. "But more importantly, a woman must want to marry the man, not just accept him because she has no other choice. So I am asking you, Elena Rodriguez, not because you need my protection, but because I hope you want to share your life with me. Will you be my wife?" Elena looked into Joe's dark eyes and saw everything she had ever hoped to find in a partner: kindness, strength, intelligence, and deep respect for her as a person. "Yes," she said simply. I will marry you, Joe River. The wedding ceremony took place on a warm day in late spring. Elena wore a dress that Luna and the other women had spent weeks creating for her, decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that told the story of her journey from the white world to the Lakota world. Joe wore traditional warrior clothing that had belonged to his grandfather, and his face glowed with pride and happiness. Chief Standing Eagle performed the ceremony, speaking in both Lakota and English, so that Elena could understand every word. The entire village participated in the celebration that followed, with dancing, singing, and feasting that lasted well into the night. As Elena danced with her new husband under the star-filled sky, surrounded by people who had become her family, she thought about the terrifying day in Fort Collins when William Patterson had attacked her. That brutal assault had seemed like the end of her world, but it had actually been the beginning of her real life. She wondered sometimes what had happened to William and to her parents. Joe had made discreet inquiries through trading contacts, and they had learned that William had eventually married a banker's daughter from Denver, a woman whose family's wealth made her a more suitable match for his ambitions. Elena's parents were doing well, and the harassment had stopped completely after Elena's disappearance. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Joe asked her one evening as they sat outside their own teepee, watching their young son play with the other children of the village. Elena looked at their 2-year-old boy, who had Joe's dark hair and her stubborn chin, and smiled. Little David, they had named him after Elena's grandfather, was completely at home in both worlds, speaking Lakota and English with equal fluency. "Never," Elena said firmly. "That life seems like a dream now, or maybe a nightmare. This is my real life." Joe pulled her closer to him. "I am grateful every day that I was in that square when you needed help. I'm grateful that you were the kind of man who would help," Elena replied. Not everyone would have. As the years passed, Elena became one of the most respected women in the village. She served as a bridge between the Lakota people and the white world, helping to negotiate treaties and resolve conflicts through her unique understanding of both cultures. She taught English to Lakota children and Lakota wisdom to white visitors who came to the village. When Joe eventually became chief after his father's death, Elena stood beside him as an equal partner in leadership. Together, they worked to protect their people, while adapting to the changing world around them. Elena never forgot the lessons she had learned during her transformation from a frightened young woman in Fort Collins to a respected leader among the Lakota. She often told young women in the village that they should never accept a life that made them small or afraid. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. Sometimes, she would say, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. But only if you're brave enough to see the opportunity hidden in the crisis. On quiet evenings, when Elena sat with her children and grandchildren around their fire, she would sometimes tell them the story of how she and Joe met. She would describe the market square in Fort Collins, the violence that had seemed so terrifying at the time, and the silent warrior who had appeared like an answer to a prayer. But what she emphasized most in these stories was not the romance or the adventure. What she wanted her descendants to understand was that every person has the power to choose their own path, even when all the choices seem difficult or dangerous. Your grandfather saw a woman being hurt, and he chose to help even though it was risky, she would tell them. I saw a chance for a different kind of life, and I chose to take it even though it meant leaving everything familiar behind. Those choices led to all of you, to this family, to this life we've built together. Elena lived to be an old woman, respected by both the Lakota people and the white settlers who knew her story. When she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, hundreds of people came to honor her memory, Native Americans and whites, young and old, people whose lives she had touched through her courage, wisdom, and kindness. Joe, who had loved her for more than 50 years, spoke at her funeral about the young woman he had first seen being attacked in a town square, and the remarkable leader she had become. She showed all of us, he said, that it doesn't matter where you start in life. What matters is who you choose to become. Elena's story became a legend among the Lakota people, passed down through generations as an example of how love and courage can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single moment of choosing to do what is right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. And in Fort Collins, now a thriving city, There is a small plaque in the old market square that reads, "Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of human kindness." Few people who read it know the story behind those words, but Elena would have been pleased by the message. She had always believed that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose to become heroes if they just had the courage to act on their deepest values. Her life had proven that this belief was not just idealistic hope, but practical truth. Love, courage, and the willingness to embrace change could indeed transform everything. One choice, one moment, one act of bravery at a time, Joe said, dismounting and helping Elena down. "I have brought someone who needs our protection." The elderly man, who Elena realized must be Joe's father, studied her with intelligent dark eyes. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Welcome, daughter. I am Chief Standing Eagle. This is Luna, who leads our women in many things." Elena felt overwhelmed by the simple dignity with which she was being greeted. In Fort Collins, her family's poverty had made them objects of pity or scorn. Here she was being welcomed as an honored guest despite being a complete stranger. "Thank you for allowing me to come," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know this is unusual." Luna stepped forward with a warm smile. "Many things in life are unusual until they become familiar. Come, you must be tired and hungry from your journey." Over the next few weeks, Elena discovered that adapting to Lakota life was both harder and easier than she had expected.